Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. Major update on the performance upgrades that Ferrari are expecting from their new rear suspension set to debut in Belgium after testing it at Mugello over the last couple of days, but also a very interesting piece of news on the power steering issue that Ferrari, it seems, have suffered with this year, especially towards the latter part of qualifying. Leclerc's complained about it, Hamilton's complained about it. We think that's the issue that they were talking about, although Ferrari still won't tell us. Apparently this issue dates back to when Carlos Sainz and Leclerc differed in their opinion on what they should do, and they went in one direction rather than the other. Very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I would greatly appreciate it. Let's get right into some driver stuff because there's always stuff going on in the market right now. This actually comes out of Honda. So one of the reasons, we mentioned it the other day, that Yuki could well be out of the Red Bull seat entirely next year. Now him leaving Red Bull wouldn't be a massive surprise. It's probably been coming for some time. Let's be honest. They weren't going to put him in the seat this year, but when Lawson was struggling and with the Japanese Grand Prix on the horizon and the mechanics and the engineers were telling the team that Lawson's cooked, mentally he's compromised. Apparently that's what they said anyway, that they had no confidence he was going to turn it around. Honda put some pressure on and said, hey, why have you still got Yuki in the sister team? You better put him in the damn Red Bull. That's what they decided to do, but at the end of this year, the Honda partnership with Red Bull comes to an end. We know that Red Bull, let's be honest, apart from maybe Marco, but they never really believed in Yuki. And, you know, I think that's probably affected his, well, it's definitely affected his career to some degree. We probably would have got a try in that car earlier than he did. And since he's been there, it's not worked out. But also the car is certainly not what it used to be a couple of years ago. The problems have just been adding on and on for that RB21. To think that at the start of last season, Verstappen had a Grand Chelem in Bahrain in 2024. The way that things have changed since then for Red Bull is remarkable, to say the least. And Honda say, yeah, Yuki's going to be there to the end of the year. But I think there's clearly an implication there that maybe after that, not so much. Could he follow Honda to Aston Martin? Possibly, but Alonso probably isn't going to go anywhere just yet, and neither is Lance Stroll, and maybe there's even an outside chance that a George Russell or a Max Verstappen could end up in that outfit, and they've only got a couple of seats. Yuki there doesn't seem very likely to me. What are the other opportunities? Maybe Cadillac, there's been links there, but I think, unfortunately, there is a good chance that Tsunoda, as good as some of the things that he's done with AlphaTauri, and now with Racing Bulls at times over the last couple of seasons, I think there's a very realistic world where Yuki does not drive ever again in Formula 1 after this year, which would be a sad reality, but I think it is, unfortunately, right now, very plausible indeed. Now, Bottas to Alpine has been causing a bit of drama as well. Gasly says it's just noise, so we'll see about that, but you know how it goes. And as we know, Red Bull are going to try and fit 5 drivers into 4 cars, but maybe Max will go and it'll be easier for them, but almost certainly Tsunoda will be out of there as well. That was the rumour that we discussed the other day, in which case they would try and get Albon, they would try and get Piastri, but of course, good luck with that. Maybe Carlos Sainz could make a magical return. We are going to talk about Sainz in the coming minutes with this whole Hamilton SF25 stuff, but of course, former Ferrari man, Ollie Behrman's actually talked about in some depth, and this of course will come as no surprise at all because he made his debut with Ferrari instead of Sainz at the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix last year. I want to race in red, I want to win in red, and well, he didn't win yet in red, but maybe getting back into a Ferrari is in the future. I think there is a very realistic possibility that when Hamilton decides to move on, then Behrman gets that drive. I can definitely see that being a progression. He's done very well, I would say, against Esteban Ocon so far. There's also the piece around whether Leclerc stays there forever, right? Like if things don't go to plan in 2026, there was a real feeling recently that Leclerc may be very tempted to say, Ferrari are not going to be the team that I'm going to be able to win the world title with. Now, speaking of Cadillac, there's a few names on the horizon. Perez, Bottas, among others. There's talk about Mick Schumacher, there's talk about Zhou Guanyu. And now there's talk about Jack Doohan. Now, it's very interesting prospect this, right? Because in the same way that Sergio Perez, he took a year off and it benefited his career massively, right? Because the team just kept getting worse and Perez now looks better and better in hindsight. And probably because of that and the money, but, you know, because of that to some degree, he's going to get the Cadillac drive, I'd imagine. Now, as the weeks go on and Colapinto continues to struggle, yeah, did Doohan have a great time in the Alpine? Absolutely not. Did he crash in Suzuka because he left the DRS open because he did it in the sim? Yes, based on our information. But it wasn't horrific. Like his runner form, obviously, like Australia was tough, but you know, it wasn't a horrific start to the season for Doohan, and certainly Colapinto's been no better. And as a result, is doing in hindsight looking a little bit better? Maybe, yeah. So therefore, Cadillac is starting a conversation on that one, but I don't know how likely that really is. But the Max to Mercedes discussion continues to dominate a lot of the headlines, and there's a very relevant update to this in a second that may, again, have some sway in Verstappen's decision to go or not to go to Mercedes as soon as 2026. And this is part of the reason, right? We've talked about this for a little while now, but there is a real feeling that Mercedes have put some pressure on Toto Wolff to say, look, we're getting embarrassed by McLaren right now. They buy our engines and they're smoking us every weekend. This is unacceptable. Toto even commented on it and said that, yeah, it was an intelligent choice at the time, but it might not have been the best decision to give them our engines, because right now, I mean, the crazy thing is that the recent failures on the engine side, or even let's just say the power unit side with Mercedes power, have been for Mercedes, for Williams, for Aston Martin, not for McLaren. Like, it feels like McLaren are integrating the Mercedes power unit into their chassis better than Mercedes themselves are, which, you know, hypothetically from Mercedes' point of view should not be possible. So that's one of the frustrations, maybe the reason why Max might be necessary to try and beat these McLaren cats that are still going to have, as we know, Mercedes engines next year. What that means for Russell is a conversation which is not going to go away, but there is a big debate on what it means for Mercedes next year, the direction in which these cars are changing. So 2026, none of us would be surprised if Mercedes have the strongest engine, and that's going to be very crucial. But as we know, it's also one of the biggest changes in the history of Formula 1 in terms of the manufacturing rules, full stop, because the engine rules changed drastically, but so do the aerodynamic regulations at the same time. Now, these have evolved and changed slightly over time. There have been some updates to them, and there was a very interesting update that Giuliano De Chessa put out today. Now, I don't know how much I can fully believe this, but I'll just tell you what the article says. The new generation of cars will no longer be ground effect. Venturi channels have been banned in a favour of a return to flat floors. Teams are developing the first models at 60% capacity in tunnels, and engineers are evaluating dozens of new body parts to test before discarding the least suitable ones. And they go on to talk about some other things as well, the cooling requirements, etc., etc. You know, great article again that the guys put together at Auto Racer. But you know, I'm not going to go through the rest of it. I just wanted to kind of highlight the first sentence here, right? Because the talk was that this year was still ground effect, but it's just ground effect to a lesser extent. Whereas this article is saying that it's flat floors and it's no ground effect. Now, this was supposedly, and I think I shared this for you guys the other day, an image of the underside of the cars in the updated renders. And I mean, yeah, like there's no Venturi tunnels going all the way from front to back. There are these little lips on the front of the floor. But, you know, I shared this the other day and I was like, well, that definitely looks flatter than we'd previously expected, maybe. But what's interesting about this, if you look it up on the internet, you will find that basically everyone will tell you that the ground effect still exists, just in a lesser degree. Much shorter Venturi tunnels, partially flat underfloor. So much shorter Venturi tunnels, I don't know, is that these little bits to the front? So I don't know, it seems to me anyway that, and De Chessa's saying it, that these cars are going to be mostly flat floored again. Ground effect maybe is going to be used in very small order, but I didn't really believe that it was going to be this much of a reduction. But that is the latest talking points, that it's going to be a major change in the level of ground effect, and it may well go to near zero. Now that has big implications. First of all, the cars are going to be slow, let's be honest, if they're not generating downforce on the floor, and the wings are going to be far less powerful than they were, let's say, between 2017 and 2021, then the cars are going to be slower. Maybe that's okay because less dirty air. Also, if they do like almost completely remove the ground effect, I think it's a bit of an indication that these ground effect cars effectively failed. I think in some respects the 2022 regulations were successful, but the implication of running the cars so stiff and so low to the ground and with such a reliance on the mechanical platform rather than, you know, real Formula 1 is you just raw dog a load of downforce onto the car as much as possible and see if it sticks. You know, obviously we had Red Bull running a high rake design, Mercedes with a lower rake approach to the way their car was set up, and you know, those were things in the flat floor era that were not the case over the last few years. So that's the rumour anyway, that the Venturi channels are basically banned and they're not able to be used to anywhere near the efficacy of what we presently have. And does that help Mercedes? I think that is the key question that I have, right? Is that Mercedes in this ground effect era have struggled. The possibility of a return to an era where ground effect is basically gone. Mercedes have a rocket ship engine, potentially, and they have no ground effect. You know, it could be a really good sign for Mercedes. It also could be a good sign for drivers like Hamilton, who don't really get on so well with the characteristics of these ground effect cars. So, yeah, it's going to be fascinating. 2026, I'm not, that's no surprise to anyone at all. But this implication was a pretty major one, to say the least. Now, another thing that the guys at Auto Racer were discussing was a few updates around Ferrari. And what was mentioned in this episode was a very interesting update on the power steering. Now, back in Silverstone, Charles Leclerc made a comment, and probably as soon as he said it, he thought shouldn't have said that, but he made a comment after qualifying, I think, and said that we're struggling with this problem with the car that's affecting us towards the end of qualifying. And if you look at the numbers, this is pretty true. Ferrari don't seem to really improve Q2 to Q3 as much as the other teams tend to do, and it feels like when the car's absolutely on a knife's edge, on the absolute limit in the final part of qualifying, when the fuel is at an absolute minimum, they struggle with finding those extra couple of tenths of performance. And that seems to be something inherent in the car. It doesn't really affect them elsewhere, but the reports that came out of the Italian press were that effectively this is a power steering problem where the car becomes just very challenging to drive in those conditions. Now, Auto Racer basically said that in 2024, now crucially I want to know when in 2024, right? Because was this pre-February the 1st or was this post-February the 1st? Because if you guys aren't aware, February the 1st, 2024 was the day that it was made official that Lewis Hamilton would be joining Ferrari for 2025 instead of Carlos Sainz, which of course was a pretty big deal. Now, whether this was a decision that was made leading into the 2024 season, then maybe it's a different story. But supposedly, Leclerc and Sainz had different perspectives on what they wanted out of their power steering. Now, it's not necessarily to say that one is better than the other, but I think it's quite clear that the implementation that they have gone for this year has been causing them problems, and Hamilton is very much aligned with this perspective. So this is what SmileTech said on their YouTube channel. Last year there were developments on power steering. Leclerc and Sainz asked for very different things. They tried to find a compromise, leaning more though towards Sainz's preferences, which first of all is interesting depending on the timing, because Sainz was leaving, so, and obviously, because Sainz left, he wasn't technically the number 2 driver, because that's not really how they did things when that was a pairing, and it worked relatively well, that pairing. But I think it was always clear that if Ferrari had to choose one driver, they would have chosen Leclerc. So why they chose Sainz to kind of follow his preferences here is definitely an interesting decision, and possibly a decision that's backfired pretty massively, to be honest, this year. The power steering stayed almost the same from last year. The problem is Hamilton arrived, who prefers the same characteristics as Leclerc, which maybe you would argue makes them a superior way to do it if Hamilton and Leclerc agree. I mean, certainly it's superior for Ferrari, it may be superior full stop. I wonder how Sainz's opinion is of the Williams in this regard. But Hamilton got into the car, and after his first lap, he said, "Does this steering have a problem? Something's wrong, right? You guys are crazy to use such steering," because he had a very different feeling with the Mercedes. Now, he goes on to describe how this is not, like, game-changing, right? Like, this is not life or death, this is not lethal. Well, okay, kind of F1 is life or death because they're driving around to corners at 210 miles an hour. But, what I'm saying, right? This isn't a situation that's going to derail the car totally, but it's just one interesting addition that has made the car seemingly problematic, especially in the final parts of qualifying, and more challenging to drive. And the fact that Hamilton got in the car, did a couple of laps and said, "Is this car broken or something?" is a pretty remarkable assessment, right, of the situation. So, that's a change that maybe in hindsight they possibly shouldn't have made, and why they made it on Sainz's preferences with respect to what Leclerc wanted, and therefore eventually what Hamilton wanted too, has held them back. But again, it's one of these things that likely they can resolve for at least 2026, and if not then, there were rumours they may have found a way to solve it immediately, even as soon as post-summer break or for the Belgian Grand Prix, and therefore give their drivers a better chance in the final part of qualifying. But the other really notable change, which is going to give the drivers a better opportunity of delivering in the second half of the season, is the new rear suspension. We looked at it yesterday. This is Charles Leclerc driving around Mugello, and this is the new rear suspension. If you guys missed yesterday's video, just the changes between the new and the old. And okay, visually Ferrari. It's not stunning, right? It's not like they've completely changed the concept, but, well, they have at least adjusted quite some element to that rear suspension to hopefully put it in a better position. And according to the data, it shows a promising return, apparently, based on what they saw in Mugello. As we said yesterday, it was hot at Mugello. The track is very taxing on the cars. So if you're going to see problems, you're probably going to see it there. You're putting the car on the absolute limit. And apparently, according to the new data, it can be run lower to the ground. The information that Motorsport Italy put together is that the new suspension better absorbs vibrations and improves the control of the ride height, therefore reducing the plank wear, which was the key thing, because with the old rear suspension, if they run it too close to the grounds, you get disqualified. And, it was very clear from China that Ferrari's season was cooked because of this issue. Now, I wasn't really expecting them to actually solve it mid-season, given that 2026 is so important, but that is what they're trying to do, and this needs to work. I honestly think for Fred Vasseur's job, this kind of needs to work, because Loic Serra came in, did not do much work in terms of designing this car, but absolutely was critical in this upgrade package, we understand. So Serra being effectively the technical lead over there now, Vasseur's appointments, relationship with Hamilton and all this stuff, this upgrade really needs to deliver, and needs to prove that spending the time working on this upgrade is actually worthwhile. Again, as we just talked about, if ground effect is getting reduced massively in 2026, then maybe some of these innovations become a little bit less relevant in terms of deciding how you're going to employ the mechanical platform for next year. I don't know if we're going to see Red Bull go back to running a rake if there's still some ground effect in there, but you know what I'm saying. But telemetry data apparently showed the new suspension is working in symmetry with the new floor introduced in Austria and is providing positive signs. The new package offers an improvement of approximately a tenth of a second. Now, a tenth is not a lot, but it is substantial enough. Okay, does it mean they're still going to be several tenths behind McLaren in race pace on certain tracks? Yeah. Does it improve the ability to control the temperatures of the rear tyres? Maybe to some degree. Does it have the trickery that McLaren have in their brake ducts? Presumably not. So in terms of race stints, it's still a little bit difficult to believe that this is going to be Ferrari able to compete with McLaren. But we know that on certain weekends, in certain characteristics, such as in Canada, the McLaren can struggle and has struggled, and it's not necessarily always the best car. And the key intention will be qualifying here, right? And the thing is, if the car is more stable under braking, which was a big discussion, yeah, maybe the car is straight up faster because you can run it lower to the ground and generate slightly more downforce and therefore can actually deliver more performance. But also, the issue with the old rear suspension was that the drivers complained a lot about instability under braking. That lacks your confidence, saps your confidence, and it means that you probably lose another at least couple of tenths just in driver confidence over a lap. So you add all these things together, and it becomes more plausible that Ferrari could be a serious challenger in the second half of the year. I think it's worth considering where this could be relevant, like what type of tracks we might see this on. So I think, we can judge it off Spa, but I think it's worth seeing it certainly in Hungary. I think we'll probably get a pretty good feeling as to whether this upgrade package has worked or not. Just the final thing to mention here on Ferrari, and obviously they're at it again, here they go. Ferrari are considering appointing an executive to act as a bridge between Vasseur and upper management, positioned above Vasseur but below Vigna and Elkann. The main role will be to ensure more effective communication between the F1 team and senior leadership in a structure that is similar to McLaren's. Now, okay, is this good or bad? Does it sound good or bad? I guess on paper, it's good. They are recognising that their communication and the way that their F1 team is structured with respect to the parent company is challenging and has caused issues and will continue to do so if it isn't changed. And, okay, trying to copy what McLaren have seems like a sensible idea as well. Do we need another person in there? I think that is the question. Could you just give Fred Vasseur more control? I think that is the debate that I would have, is to say, okay, could this be solved by giving the team principal the power that he probably should have, that Ferrari have been unwilling to give? Maybe. do we need to add another person into the mix as well? Who, is there another bridge, right, between Vasseur and the management? Is that necessary? Maybe, if Fred Vasseur's got so much to do that he doesn't have the time to directly communicate with the top bosses. But it strikes me as a symptom of the problematic Ferrari setup, more so than as an ideal solution. But very much interested your perspective, as ever, in the comments section below. Enjoy this beautiful graphic that F1 came out with. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care, and I'll see you next time.